Now, every man and their goblin has done a YouTube video over the last few months talking about tier lists and what's the best DPS in Wrath of the Lich King. I'm not here to tell you they're wrong, but I'm also not here to tell you they're right. Instead, I'm bringing you hard facts with a lot of data behind it. Now, I've got to shout out Misty on Twitch for actually sending me this, because I use this website a lot looking for historic posts of Wrath of the Lich King to see what's right with private servers and what's wrong with private servers. And trust me, there's a lot when you look at private servers that you need to just forget about, because it's going to be different in Classic. But one thing from original Wrath of the Lich King to today, which will change very little, is the amount of DPS that we do. And you've got to remember, by the time ICC was out, the skill level of players was a lot higher. Don't get me wrong, they didn't have the 10 years or so sat on private servers perfecting their classes, but these data sets are so big that it will really give you a good idea. So let's run through it. All of this was taken from World of Logs. If you don't know what World of Logs is, it's basically what Warcraft Logs is today. It provided a lot of useful information, far more than just DPS, and they also post the top 200 DPS results for each boss and spec. About 30,000 raid passes were uploaded to World of Logs every week. So a little bit about this data set. All the data was for ICC 25-man normal. The data for average DPS was gathered from a sampling of about 25% of all raid passes during the 10% raid buff period in ICC. This ensures that the raid buff was the same for all passes, and the gear levels are fairly recent. The data encompasses all gear levels, all skill levels, and includes both wipes and kills. Any results that were 0 DPS because they were being boosted or AFK were removed before calculations. Some important information. The number does not in any way represent the damage that you can do or your class can do. It's possible that certain specs reflect higher not because they're capable of more DPS, but just because they're easier to play. And that's important to remember. If you see your class really low down on the damage meters here or on the logs here, don't be disheartened, because I'm sure you will do just fine if you're exceptional. And you'll see what I mean when we look at the top passes versus the average passes and how some of these classes move around. The graphs are formatted to show the scale starting at near the lowest represented DPS rather than at 0. This in effect is zooming in to get a high fidelity view of the comparative DPS. Actual DPS numbers are included, rounded to the nearest 100. You'll see some specs that may not even be included in some of this, like Frost Mages and Sub-Rogues, just because they're so underrepresented. And that's because they're useless. If you're planning on rolling a Death Knight, Death Knights are also not included in this, purely because trying to differentiate between tanks and DPS across 3 different specs was very difficult for them back in the day. We know that's not the case today with Warcraft Logs. So first of all, if we look at the average ICC DPS, the chart shows us average DPS spec for all ICC bosses combined. So some fights favour certain classes or certain specs, but once you combine it all, this is what the distribution looks like. Assassination Rogues have a clear lead, a trend that will continue as we progress. But interestingly, if you remove them, then every class has a spec within 10% of the top DPS. On the low end, we have our 4 poor specs: Frost Mages, Sub-Rogues, BM Hunters, and Arms Warriors. They will generally hang out on the low end throughout every data set, though Arms Warriors do not appear quite as bad as others. So looking at this, across all bosses, back in the day, we had Assassination Rogues in first place, Fire Mage, then Combat, then Affliction and Demo Warlocks, Marksman Hunter, Feral Druid. Why so low? Shadow Priests, Fury Warriors, Ret Paladins, Enhancement. You can see slowly make your way down to Boomy, and then really anything below Boomy you wouldn't even really consider a DPS. Now this is where it gets interesting. If we look at Festegut DPS, this is a very melee-friendly fight. For all melee classes, this fight is just a training dummy and should treat all melee equally. Ranged have to do some moving and are subject to vile gas, which can hit them up to 6 or more times each fight, substantially hurting their DPS potential. But just looking at this, you can see how far ahead Rogue is to everything else. Feral Druid's sitting just below, and then it slowly makes its way all the way back down to Boomy again. But this is all passes, this is all skill levels, all gear levels, everything, you know, over 25,000 or whatever it said, you know, different passes, putting it all together and then getting an average. You might not be average. So if we now look at Festegut taking the top 200, so this is the top raid passes for each spec, you can see it's a very different story. So now we're talking, these are the better players. The top 200 of each class. You've still got rogues at the top, but look at how everything's shifted around with Mage, Fury, Feral, and look how high Boomy is now compared to where it was before. So we can clearly see that Boomy, if you're a better player, you can perform very, very well and almost equally to everybody else. The chart definitely looks a lot more realistic to what the player base is like today. because I do believe that we are probably better than we were back then. I think there's not going to be massive differences. I'm not saying that this chart's going to be small. We're going to be doing double the DPS. It's not going to be like that because there's not that much you can do wrong. You know, the theory crafting that happened back then, we still rely on to a certain extent today. By that, I mean, you know, things like elitist jerks. You know, everything that needed to be worked out has already been worked out. We might find a few cheesy ways of doing things. We always do when it comes to Classic. But overall, looking at these, you can see what I've been saying all along, where play whatever class you want. You know, if you watch my class picking guide that I've done, you literally can play any single class, and one of those specs will perform very well. And it's worth noting when you look at this one, DKs actually are included. They're not included in the overall, but they're included on Festegut here, and you can see where Frost is sitting versus Unholy versus Blood. So you've got Frost sitting at the top here, just over Unholy, and Unholy over Blood. But both of them sit very middle of the pack, and I would expect to see Warriors a little bit higher. You've got to remember this is only 25-man normal, so some of these people won't be in full BIS, and that's what a lot of tier lists are based off, being full ICC 25 heroic geared, and then saying, right, Furies are the best DPS. But let's be honest, by the time you're full ICC 25 heroic geared, Cata will be out, or something else will be out. You know, you're going to probably get some ICC 25 heroic gear, and you'll get your Shadow Morn, you'll get your Deathbringer's Will. Be in every single slot BIS, when we know how quick Classic seems to move nowadays, highly unlikely, and not really worth worrying about. This is actually a good set of data to base your guesstimations on how you're going to perform. And then if we look at Rotface, now this is switched round, so this is a more ranged-friendly fight, because at times everyone has to run, and ranged classes at least have the option of occasionally being able to launch off some instant attacks from range, where the melee are forced to just watch the fight unfold. It's enough to finally knock the rogues out of the top slot, but just barely. So now you've got your Fire Mage on top, you're seeing all the melee drop down a little bit, and you know, the casters rising up a little bit, but again, this is the average DPS across everybody. When we look at it again, but for the top 25, look at what a different picture it paints. We've now still got Hunters on top, followed by Arcane Mages. The Rogues are still sitting up there quite strong, but now Boomy, look how high Boomy is on Rotface, because it can instant, you know, use its dots and everything when it's moving. And when we're looking at these, the top 200 passes for each class, you can quite clearly see it paints a very even picture again. There is not a massive difference between saying Destruction at the bottom there, all the way to Marksman at the top. There's a couple of thousand DPS difference, but as an average, you're talking middle of the pack classes, your Warlocks, your Shadow Priests, your Ferals, all still very, very strong. And that's it. It was only a quick video. I just wanted to show you it because it's a really interesting article. Again, showing you everybody as an average for every class and where they sit. The top 200, which, let's face it, we all strive to be in the top 200 on Warcraft logs. So if you're one of those people that regularly is passing, you know, 97, 98, 99 or 100 passing, then, you know, you can expect the top 200 ones to be a fairly accurate representation of what sort of damage you're going to do. Now, remember, this was ICC 25-man normal. Some of these people could even just still be in TOC 25 gear. So you could say some of these numbers might be achievable late tier 9, very early tier 10. But overall, again, I thought it was a very interesting article. It's not a tier list, and this is why looking at tier lists is pretty pointless, because they won't accurately represent what we've just looked at now. I'm pointing down at my iPad, not up. Honestly, it's the iPad I'm pointing at. It just looks a bit weird, don't it? Anyway, like and subscribe. Roll the outro. There's lots of ways you can support the channel to keep me here putting out World of Warcraft content and covering all future MMOs. Consider joining the channel as a member. You get access to emotes. Everyone will know you're a member when you comment on future videos because you get a nice icon next to your name. And you get access to members-only videos, which I'll be putting a lot of on the channel throughout the year. Additionally, there's a Patreon link in the description as well. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you on the next one.